is Lesley Malus Reed. I'm President of Integral Healthcare Solutions. I'd like to welcome you and thank you for joining us. We're very enthusiastic about having you all. We had a lot of registrants for this. I assume that a lot of people are going to join in as we go on. Now we're up to 60 people joining us just instantly there. Our topic is going to focus on the clinical aspect of URAC's new Specialty Pharmacy and Mail Service Pharmacy 4.0 standards. The title is What's Changed? The topic title is New Old SP MSP What's Changed? As I said, I'm Lesley Malus. I'm President of IHS. I'll be acting as your moderator today. Please note that we'll be summarizing things of what we're talking about in the chat section. So if you hover down below in this webinar mode, you will see that you can hit chat and you'll see that we can start writing to one another, and we have somebody who's going to be writing the themes of what we're talking about over there. If you have a question or need to reach out to us, you're having difficulty hearing us, or you just want to reach out to us, you can reach out there. But you'll also notice that there's a Q&A box down at the below there as you hover. And over there, if you wouldn't mind sharing some questions that you might have with us or for us, and if we can answer it and it's simple, we'll answer it right away in real time. Otherwise, we'll be asking Sue and Tom, who are panelists for us today, to answer as we go along. Let me introduce our panelists. Tom Goddard is our CEO and founder of IHS, and Sue DeMarino is our Chief Clinical Officer. And I'll invite them at this time just to tell a little bit about themselves. Tom, would you mind going first?
Sure, thanks, Lesley. My name, as Lesley said, is Tom Goddard. I am the founder and chief executive officer of Integral Healthcare Solutions, which I founded just a little over 18 years ago. Before that, I was the chief operating officer and general counsel of URAC. And in addition to being a lawyer, I'm an industrial organizational psychologist with lots and lots of experience in the URAC world in particular, but in healthcare dating back to about 1990. And I'll turn it over to Sue DeMarino, our Chief Clinical Officer. Who are you?
Hi, I'm Sue. I've been with IHS for a little over 4 years. Prior to that, I was at URAC for 17 years. That's where I first met Lesley and Tom back in 1999. And while I was there, I served many roles, including being a reviewer, being a director, being the vice president of accreditation. And I'm really happy to be here with you today to talk about the new specialty and mail standards.
Thanks, Sue. So I'm going to turn it over again to Tom, and he's going to give a brief overview about what are the major changes that you can see structurally, and where were these standards in the 3.0 and how have they really changed in the 4.0. So Tom, if you can give a historical and global view of what's happening, what people can expect.
Happy to do that. Thanks, Lesley. So the most recent version before October of last year were Core 3.2 of both mail service and specialty pharmacy. And for those of you who have already gone through that accreditation, what you'll remember is that the core standards, like as has been the case with many URAC programs for many years, the core standards were their own freestanding module. And then the specialty pharmacy and mail service pharmacy standards were a separate module. So one of the major changes when URAC came out with its new standards 4.0 in both cases last fall is that first of all, the new core standards replaced the old core standards. And by the new core standards, I mean Core 4.0, which was released about a year and a half earlier in February of 18. But those standards were only rolled out to a couple of programs, case management and organizational management in particular. So 18 months later, we take those Core 4.0 standards, but instead of a separate module, URAC has woven those standards into the specialty pharmacy and mail service pharmacy version 4.0 standards. So you won't find the separate module in the program as you did in the previous versions. That's one major area. Another area that you'll notice the difference if you haven't looked at the standards already is the way the standards are clustered and structured. Now there are focus areas which cluster standards together, and beneath them are elements of performance which correspond to the old standards. A focus area is a cluster of standards, and an element of performance is what you might think of as a veteran URAC person as a standard. Another change that was first launched in the telehealth and Core 4.0 and Case Management 6.0 standards is the difference in scoring. For historical sake, it used to be there were mandatory elements and elements that had point values of 1, 2, 3, or 4, plus leading indicators. Under the new standards, they've eliminated the point values of 3 and 1. So we've still got mandatory elements, and we still have point values, but only of 4 and 2. And we still have some leading indicator elements. And the leading indicators, to remind you, have no direct impact on your accreditation. They simply are URAC's way of gathering information about what's happening in the marketplace. And it's a testing ground for URAC to explore possible new standards for the next version. I'll speak at a very high level about the rest of the standards and then turn it over to Lesley again for the next piece of this. But the very highest level, the CSCD standards that you may have been familiar with have been split into two sections: pharmacy operations, which existed before. So some of those old CSCD standards went into the pharmacy operations or farm op standards. And then the remainder of them went over into a new section called patient service and communication. So that's one structural change. And another structural change is there is no more specialty drug utilization management or mail service drug utilization management. Those standards were folded into other areas, or actually kind of compressed and funneled into pharmacy operations. And basically it's just prescription order review requires drug utilization review. I think I'll stop there and toss it back to you, Lesley.
Thanks, Tom. So Sue is going to take us really through a perspective of what's changed, what's new, what you can expect. She's going to highlight some of the biggest additions, biggest deletions, and we're going to start first with a historical perspective. As you know, every time URAC changes their standards, they raise the bar a little bit and they become a little more tricky. So Sue's job and focus today is really going to be about what are those tricky areas and what we should watch out for. So Sue, if you wouldn't mind just talking about it first globally and then jumping into the clinical aspects.
Okay, sure. Well, the good news is that many of the standards are the same. They've been repackaged and many of them have been better organized. So for a few examples of that, if you may remember, for those of you who are already accredited, when there was an issue with the patient getting their medication, you found variations of those requirements, and I believe it was 5 different standards. Now they've taken that and they've put it into one area, and it's basically called handling breakdowns, tracking shipments, things like that. And then also another great example is the controlled substances. In the previous version, controlled substances were addressed in 3 of the pharmacy operations standards. Now there's one standard that basically handles all of the controlled substances. And then the major difference between specialty pharmacy and the mail service pharmacy standards in the past used to be the patient management standards. And then there were some standards that had little nuances, little changes that were, or little differences between them. So for instance, in one of the drum standards in the older versions, the standard under mail was mandatory and under specialty was a weighted standard. So that has all the differences between the standards have gone away. And in the 4.0 version, the only difference between male and specialty are the PM standards. So that's good. We don't have to worry about those little nuances anymore. And then there's an example of something that has expanded. Is the verification standard. I don't know if you remember, all of you, in the pharmacy ops standards, there was a standard, I think it was PharmOp 2, that required you to identify how you're going to verify the payer, the patient, things like that. Well, this standard has been expanded. So now they want you to identify how you're promoting cost-effective medical management. How are you making sure that the patient is in scope of your pharmacy services? What criteria are you using to bring patients into your program? And does this specific patient fit into that scope? Do they have the right coverage benefits? And then before, where they would look for information about what type of financial assistance you provided, now there's an actual standard that says you're going to help the patient with financial assistance. So those are some of the major differences at a high level. So Les?
Thanks, Sue. So give me a little bit about what you think would be the biggest additions, starting with patient management.
Okay, so in patient management, all of you remember that there was a standard that dealt with assessments, but URAC never identified what the categories of the assessment had to be. Now they have. There's a standard that says you have to identify the patient, and it's a mandatory standard, so it's a deal breaker. And all of these elements have to be addressed. The diagnosis has to be captured, the medication list, the patient's comorbidities, any allergies, their medication history. Are they able to self-administer? And what are the chances of them reaching their therapeutic goals based on the outcomes that you want to see for this patient? The other thing that's different is the counseling topics prior to first use of the medication has been expanded. So in addition to the counseling that was on side effects, how to store the meds, how to destroy them, things like that, you also have to provide the expectation and possible outcome of therapy to the patient. You have to tell them how long you think the duration of therapy will be. If they're on any type of vaccinations, you have to provide counseling on that vaccination. And they've expanded the side effects from just evaluating for side effects. They want you to counsel them on how to prevent them, how to minimize them, and how to manage them. So those are the three big areas, or 3 or 4 big areas in counseling that's been expanded. And if you remember before, the counseling topics were all but one, I think there were 9 of them, and all but one were mandatory. Now you have those, plus these additional 4 that you have to address.
So that could be a really big jump, because now our clients and applicants are going to have to get ready for more mandatory standards that are happening to the prior side of this. So they're going to have the infrastructure as well to be able to set that up. Is that correct?
That is very correct. That's a great comment, Les.
What about coordination of care?
Okay, so remember that anytime URAC uses the word mechanism, you have to define what that mechanism is. And this one gave me pause, because I can tell you that every time I do a mock validation visit with our clients, they always struggle with that external referral if a patient needs something. Now, URAC has, again, they've defined it not only in what used to be in the core standards, but now they're saying you have to have a mechanism to dispatch issues. Now, again, URAC hasn't defined that term yet, but my guess is it means it's a referral for anything with social determinants of health to the appropriate authority. And that URAC has given you some examples: financial assistance, transportation assistance, employment assistance. physical environment assistance. So for instance, if they can't walk up steps and they have 6 steps to get into their home, where can you make a referral to? And any type of social support that they might need. So Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, things like that, behavioral health. So this is a big jump for organizations to really get involved in that coordination of care. Now, what could some of those mechanisms be?
Mm-hmm.
Well, if you're working with a PBM or a health plan, you could make referrals to the case management departments of those organizations. If you're dealing with, if your client is a hospital, it might be a referral to a social worker. If you have, if it's related to something with financial assistance, again, there's a standard now that says you have to have a process, but you might outreach to PBMs or some of those places that give grants, or have a discounted rates for commercial patients, things like that. So those are some examples. Transportation might be like some of the county programs have programs where there's free transportation for folks to the doctor's office. Some of the hospitals offer it. I used to work at West Penn Hospital in Pittsburgh, and they actually had a van that would go out and pick up patients. And you could tap into that through the social service department. So it's important for you to know what coordination of care programs are in the area where you serve. The Case Management Society of America used to have a coordination of care tool that listed all the home care agencies, all the DME companies, all the transportation companies, and it was put out by Mosby, I think. So you may want to look to see if CMSA still has that tool available to you.
Okay, that is a really big jump from having coordination of care, thinking of it from a transfer from one pharmacy to pharmacy to really this dispatching now. So that is a big investment in thinking about the resources that you need to reach out to. So not financial investment, but the human resources. Can you please tell me a little about what we could expect from our pharmacy operations section? So I feel like there has been major changes in that people know in the farm. We used to call it farm ops. So just for those who might be new to specialty pharmacy or mail service, it's the pharmacy operations section.
Okay, well, as many of you probably know who have been accredited, probably the one standard that caused the most heartburn for all of our clients and for even folks who aren't our clients has been the cold chain standard. It's almost like you can never get it right. No matter what you submit on your policy and procedure, URAC typically asks for an update to your policy and procedure, a tweaking of the language. So with each new version of the standards, they continue to raise that bar on cold chain. And one of the things that I want you to know is that under the previous version, you had to have criteria for the selection of your packaging products. You had to have criteria for which modes of transit you were going to ship. If it was going to be a courier, FedEx, UPS, you needed to identify what criteria your staff had in order to determine which packing products to use, what mode of transit you were going to use. And then the validated distribution process required you to have an annual review of that validated distribution process. And for that initial validation distribution process, for when you were getting accredited by URAC, you could use your vendor of your packing material to provide that information. The ongoing monitoring had to be done by your organization, and they required it to be annually, and if your products change. So when they're talking about products, it's your shipping boxes, your gel packs, things like that. It had to be based on manufacturer recommendations, And you had to have mechanisms in place to ensure that the correct packaging was being used and that your staff was following those instructions. So how did your organization do that? You had to identify the delivery delays and breakdowns in the distribution process, and then there was requirements for the quality reporting. So under the new version that includes the pharmacy operations 8.1, 8.2, 8.3, there are now 3 standards that deal with this. They're not just limiting it to cold chain, and they're referencing the USBP 659. And if you've not Googled that, I would encourage you to do that. It's recommendations from the regulators that basically tell you what temperature pharmaceutical meds should be kept refrigerated, for frozen, for room temperature, for room humidity. So if you rely on that document, you can pretty much ensure that you'll be in compliance with the URAC requirements. So not only do you have to do this validation process for your cold products, you have to have mechanisms in place to identify how you've tested your frozen products, how you've tested your room temperature products. You have to identify temperature ranges for each of them. You have to have criteria for each on when you're selecting packaging. You're required to identify an excursion allowance. That's a new piece of it. There was not an excursion allowance requirement under the validated distribution process and the old shipping standard. Now they've expanded it. They've included all ways that you're shipping under different temperatures and stored, and you're going to have to identify that excursion allowance. It requires qualification testing, meaning you've identified before you implement your process to ship room temperature, frozen, refrigerated products. It has to be based on geographic distribution. So are you shipping to Alaska? Are you shipping to Florida or to Arizona? How does that look different? So you have to take that into consideration. It requires the, and if there are any changes in with your products, then you have to update again. The ongoing testing, they've expanded it from once a year to twice a year. You again have to test it based on different geographic areas and different temperature profiles, just as we did with before implementation. Okay. Then you have to identify the mechanism, and remember what I told you about mechanism. You have to identify what that mechanism is, and you have to ensure that you have proper packaging and shipping. So how are you going to do that? Is it through direct visualization? Is a pharmacist going to look at every package that you're getting ready to ship before it's shipped to make sure it's packaged correctly? Or are you going to do periodic audits where you pull a certain number of packages per month, per quarter, and verify that they've packaged it the way they should? And all updates are going to be based on this qualification testing that you're going to do and any shipping complaints that you get. So when you're tracking your complaints, one of them should be related to shipping. One of your buckets should be related to shipping. And when you identify a trend, then you have to relook at the way you're packaging and shipping and see if you need to make updates based on that. Okay. So those are some heavy lifts for you guys. Some other new things, while URAC has always recommended the tracking of near miss, it's now a requirement. It has been as I said, before it was recommended, now it's a requirement for you to track not just actual errors, but near miss tracking. There are some explicit requirements for the REMS and any other federal or FDA requirements or specific manufacturer requirements You have to have mechanisms in place to be able to ensure that you're in compliance with that. That's where your compliance department may help you. Another change to the pharmacy operation standards, while there was always there were references to hazardous material in the standards. Now you must define the hazardous materials that are housed in your pharmacy. So it's not just the medications, but it's cleaning supplies or anything that's on that NIOSH list. That's a great resource for you, is to reference your NIOSH list. And then how are you doing training on hazardous material, both for staff and for patients? How is that occurring? So there's some additional rigor in the hazardous area. There's a new leading indicator. Again, remember, as Tom said, leading indicators are optional standards. You can choose to meet them or you can choose not to, about thermal mapping. And there, if you Google pharmaceutical thermal mapping, it's very clear on what it is. It's identifying, you know, where your medications are going to be kept, where they're never going to be kept, things like that. So it's actually almost like a blueprint of where that's going to be. And Kristen will update a link to a website that has some information on thermal mapping for you in the chat. So if you're interested in getting some of that information, it's there.
So before we move on from cold chain, which has always been really tough for all of our clients to meet completely comprehensively, I'd like to just circle back. We have a few questions now, and I'm going to first of all invite everybody to remind them that if you scroll at the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A box for you to put your questions. So while we roll back to answer the first question from a discussion earlier, I'll invite you to think about some of the questions you might have on cold chain. So right now we have one question asking, going back to our question about dispatch issues.
About what, Leslie? I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
I'm sorry, about coordination of care, basically.
Oh, okay, all right, coordination of care.
The question is, would chasing customer refills on a vital medication count as coordination of care with this new requirement?
That could be an example of one, but they specifically give these others as what they're looking for in the interpretive information. So okay. Yes, it's important for you to make sure that the patient has their medications on time and things like that. But again, it's not limited to just that.
And so just
as it's for those things, if you look at the requirement, it's the social determinants of health. Making those you have a mechanism to dispatch issues with social determinants of health to the appropriate entity. And as I said earlier, that could be the health plan, the PBM. It could be the hospital system that you're working with. If you're doing a lot of transplant patients, there's probably a transplant coordinator that you might be working with in under specialty.
Okay. The next question about cold chain had to do with whether you foresee URAC asking for thermal mapping on the site for non-cold chain product storage as well with the new standard.
It is, right now it's a leading indicator. I think it will stay a leading indicator for a while because I don't believe the industry has embraced it fully. There, as I said, Kristen has put the website up that might help you look at that and where the industry is going. Again, it only time will tell. The fact that it is been identified as a leading indicator lets you know that URAC is looking at it. Someone is very in tune to it and see the value of it. So just to be aware that that's something that is coming down the pike. You can choose not to meet it, and you would just provide either an attestation or that says that you're choosing not to meet this leading indicator.
So we have another question, and I'm going to ask Tom to answer this one.
Yeah, let me jump in. One of the questions is, there are probably some folks who weren't able to make this call or didn't realize they should be on this call that would benefit from some of what we're talking about here. And we are recording this, so and we'll make this recording available to you so you can share. share it with whoever in your organization needs to see it. So that's the good news.
All right, so I think that's the end of our questions for so far. Okay, yes, for right now. All right, so we talked about the biggest additions that we saw that were tricky. What about the big deletions? What's coming up there?
Okay, well, those of you who have specialty accreditation probably remember the PM program annual evaluation, where you had to have objective and subjective clinical outcomes. You had to identify a financial outcome, and you could either have a subjective or an objective quality of life metric that you were monitoring and reporting out on. Under the new version, they've taken out the subjective and objective requirement, and you can just identify which metric you want to monitor. You do, however, have to define the strengths and weaknesses of the metrics, and you have to evaluate what those strengths and weaknesses are. These metrics must be available to be reported to current and prospective clients as requested. What I would recommend that you do is to develop a template in which you would include that information so that you give it to your clients as part of a marketing. It would help you if you had really good metric outcomes to report as you're trying to get new clients. You could share that, you know, how you're doing from a specialty program. And then for your current clients, it may help you keep those clients. So I think it's a great tool. The other thing, the other big change is, if you remember, it was the care plan requirements. There's no requirement for a care plan other than in the very beginning when I spoke to you about therapeutic goals and outcomes. So it could be identified as a therapeutic goal outcome, but all the requirements of a measurable baseline, a measurable goal, what interventions you're putting in place, how you're communicating it to the patient, the provider, how motivated the patient is in reaching this goal. That has all gone away. I will tell you, however, I know we're talking about URAC, but for those of you that have dual accreditations, ACHC still maintains the requirement of a care plan for every patient. Now, the requirement from ACHC is a little different. It's not as rigorous. And it can be as simple as making sure that the care plan is that you're going to get them their meds on time and that they're going to have therapeutic benefit. I mean, it could be as simple as that for ACHC. But just as you're thinking about whether to do away with the, excuse me, as you're thinking about doing away with the care plan requirements, if you have dual accreditation, you may want to rethink that. Okay, let's see. And then, Tom, I'm going to turn it over to you to talk about any of the next webinar we're going to have. But I wanted to offer the group any other questions that we could entertain.
Thanks so much, Sue. That's really helpful to hear all of that. And I want to echo Sue's and Les's invitation to please, we got some open space here, so toss your questions into the Q&A box and we'll tackle them as we can. We will be doing a webinar next month. We're zeroing in on a date and we'll let you all know when that is, probably somewhere in the middle of the month. And it will cover the non-clinical aspects of the specialty and mail service pharmacy version 4.0 standards. And that'll cover what you might know as core from the old standards, issues like the contracting and delegation, which we may speak a little bit about today. And let's see, human resources and customer satisfaction, client satisfaction, and quality management, although that has a clinical component to it, certainly. and we'll also do the more administrative non-core standards as well, including those CSCD standards that have remained on the administrative side. Let me toss that over to you, Les, to talk a little bit about a little tease the next month's
Sure.
program, give a little hint of what's to come.
Sure. Well, historically, the CSCD standards really had to do with once you have an enrollee, what is it that you send out to give them some information about your services, your operations, and if there were any inquiries about things such as what do I do about drug recalls and how do I get information about claims and shipping orders. That was historically under the CSCD standards. So the big change there is that they've really now tidied them up. They have revised them so there's not as many. If you remember, if you're going through reaccreditation, CSCD 1, 7, 11, there was a lot of redundancy. So they have now been able to clean that up a little bit, and they've dispersed the standards. There's no CSCD section. They're now in the patient service and communication section, as well as the ops section. So rights and responsibility will be in the ops section, while the how do I call you for a drug recall information or to reach a pharmacist would be under that patient service communication. So these are the types of things that we'll tackle next time, as well as the core standards have been restructured into different sections.
Excellent.
Sorry.
Yeah, let me jump in here, Les. A couple of you have asked, when you reapply, when do you need to start meeting these new standards? There's a technical answer, and then there's a practical answer. The technical answer is that so long as you are accredited under, you are required to comply with the standards you are currently accredited under. And you don't need to be compliant with the new standards, and this isn't just true for these standards, this is true across the whole world of URAC. You don't need to start complying with the new standards until you submit your accreditation agreement with URAC. So that'll be roughly a year before your expiration date. That's the technical answer. The practical answer is start now. Some of these are not flip a light switch kind of changes. I mean, as you heard Sue talk about, the cold chain is going to require a radical expansion of your surveying, your testing, your pre-packaging testing, and so so I'd recommend that you start early. Also, if there are some changes on the core side that are perhaps more significant than they might appear on the surface, the delegation standards it's kind of funny. The delegation standards look like they've shrunk and become much easier to comply with, and while that's true in a couple of small ways, it's actually not true in the fullest sense of the word. There's a
There's lovely music.
Yeah, well, someone else take that. I'm going to mute for a second.
Let me just say one thing before you jump into explaining what the changes in delegation is, that I encourage you, if you are going to start planning, is to always take the highest standard. For example, in HR, that area where there used to be a requirement to have annual self-evaluations, now URAC is going to allow, under this new version of that standard, for you to decide how often it is. So it could be every 2 years, for example. But we need you to still take the highest road, because URAC has monitoring on sites. And you need to be able to demonstrate compliance with your mandatory standards for when they come on site and review you for a monitoring on site. So you'll be reviewed under your current version of standards. Some of our clients don't start until they're contractually required to because of that. And some of our clients we're encouraging to think about it because there's truly new systems that you're going to have to take on. And if it's the higher standard, certainly go for it, and you'll be fine with your monitoring on site. Sue, do you have something to add to that?
I was just going to say the cold chain would be a perfect example of that, Leslie, because this is raising the bar. And while you still have the requirement for cold chain, there's also requirements for the other ways you package and ship. So that might be where you may start. And I agree with you. You have to be careful that you don't you don't stop doing something that was required under 3.2 that is no longer required under 4.0.
And also to note is that these monitoring on sites used to be, for those who are veterans that have been doing this for several years, they used to be a lottery. And if you won the lottery, you got this surprise monitoring on site. But it's no longer a lottery. It's going to happen now. It usually happens mid-cycle, and it's just part of the process now. URAC wants to make sure that you are going to maintain your compliance within that 3 years between your accreditations. They usually call you about 5 days in advance, or it could be 2 or 3. Or if there's a complaint, an egregious complaint, then they will show up and there's no notice. Go ahead, Tom.
Let me toss in this. Some of you have asked offline in another context, is there anything, any kind of assistance that our firm can provide in that interim and with that transition? And the answer to that is yes. We have, for the last couple of years, run a program that we call the Ongoing Compliance Maintenance Program, in which we provide virtual audits, if you like, on-site audits to make sure the wheels haven't come off or no bolts have come unscrewed in your processes, with the idea that keeping on top of the requirements of your current program is not automatic. It doesn't just happen. And we can help you get an extra set of eyes in on your process to make sure nothing is wiggled loose. The other thing we offer in this is that as you approach that period of time that you're going to need to transform yourself into a version 4.0 company, we can provide counsel on how best to do that. And I'll put in the chat box some contact information. Just write me an email and I'd be happy to talk to you about it.
Right, and my understanding now, as Lesley indicated, where, as she said, it used to be a like winning the lottery. Their goal is to visit every organization. They may not get to every organization, but that is their goal. And it's usually a virtual review, and they're a little more flexible with the dates than they used to be. And so you might be able to negotiate a different date if they're like, for instance, if you have a payer coming in or you have a different audit that day, you can give them that information and they'll work with you.
20 years ago, we even before there was a formal program, Sue and I were involved in a very sudden monitoring on-site review before the monitoring on-site review program happened. We called from the airport. But yes. It was a very special case, and URAC's not doing that anymore. It occurs to me that we never, for those of you that don't know us or don't know our process, we have a couple of minutes here until the next question pops up to talk a bit about what we do and how we do it. We support pharmacies. In fact, our main line of work is working with specialty and mail service pharmacies. Didn't start out that way. We started out because URAC wasn't in the world. There was no pharmacy accreditation when we started this company, but we track URAC and the rest of the accreditation organizations to wherever they go, and especially pharmacy and mail service pharmacy has really exploded over the last half dozen years. So this is what we do most of the time. Our process is basically 3 major stages. The first stage, we do either a gap analysis or a standard by standard discussion in which we put our specialists, the 3 of us and our head pharmacist, get on the phone with you and talk about each and every standard, either at a top level or at a detailed level, depending on where you are in the process, about every single standard, making sure you first understand the standard, and second, understand what documentary requirements are attached to each standard. What do you need to submit? And I'll make a little amendment here. This isn't just the URAC process. We also work with clients applying for ACHC and VIPs. We've supported Joint Commission, specialty pharmacy accreditation applicants as well. And for those health plan folks peeking in on this, we also support NCQA accreditation for health plan and other modules, but not pharmacy, of course. So, as a result of that process, the gap analysis or standard by standard discussion process, we generate a report for you that lays out all of the all of the documentary requirements that you'll need to be working on over the next few weeks or months to get ready for submission to URAC. As each of those standards documents are ready, you upload them to a piece of proprietary software of ours called Goldfinch. You click a button, and then it goes to an associate consultant who triages it, makes sure that you've got all the documents in place, and then the associate consultant then turns it over to the senior consultant who is assigned to that standard. So as you can see, we're all specialists here. We've got Sue, the head clinician, we've got a pharmacist, we've got Les, who's in charge of a whole bunch of the administrative standards, and myself, who's more focused on issues like documents or delegation, oversight, and contracting. So we then, because we've all been URAC reviewers before, we do the kind of review that that the URAC reviewer would do. And we have the URAC scoring system built into our software. So we score it like URAC would score it, and we give you feedback on any standards that you don't get a perfect score on. So, and that's all through the process. It's not all at once like URAC does it. We do it as standards become ready. So you have plenty of time on the early standards to fix those up while you're working on the harder standards later in the process. It rolls over for a few months in most cases. And then when all of your standards are ready to go, we let you know, and you submit to URAC. And then URAC starts its desktop review process. If along the way you need to fix any documents based on our comments, you can submit them again for a second look, and we'll give you more feedback on that. So you submit your documents to URAC. URAC takes about 5 weeks, 30 business days, to turn your formal official desktop review around. And that, and then you'll get an email from URAC, and URAC will say, go back into AccreditNet, and you can see what more questions we have for you. You simply let us know that you got that email. We take the comments out of AccreditNet, URAC's system, and put it into Goldfinch, our system, so that we can look over what you submitted and what URAC says and give you advice on how best to respond to URAC's comments. And there are different kinds of responses based on whether URAC has overlooked something or there's a new interpretation of a standard, but we'll help you through that process. Click another button and we upload the documents again for you. And hopefully, and usually, that once back and forth with URAC, if everybody's listening to each other, it resolves any remaining questions that URAC might have. So then, also around that time that you get that, or a few weeks later, we send two of our senior team, either two of the three of us, or one of us with our senior pharmacy consultant, Judy Kuhn, to your facility or facilities, if you have more than one site, and conduct a mock validation review. And we structure it just like URAC structures it, except a little bit more. And this is a really key thing to know about how we do this. This is not simply a drop in and review a few documents for 6 hours process. This is, we do everything URAC does plus consult. So we actually put a little more time, not a little less time, into the process, so that you're not caught off guard, and so that we find everything that could conceivably be found by the URAC reviewers. And we write up a report. At each of these stages, you're getting full documentation, full report, full scoring from us, so that you can spend those last few weeks before URAC shows up for its validation review, tweaking and implementing any corrective action plans that we've recommended that you implement to fix any loose bolts in your system. And obviously, we're also available to answer your questions throughout. Come on and do spot inspections well in advance of our mock validation review. Any kind of service actually that you need help with. We have template policies and procedures within Goldfinch for across all of the standards. If you don't have an appropriate policy and procedure on policies and procedures, we've got a template for that. And you can't submit the template, but you can take our template and use it to build your own policies and procedures that are compliant with the URAC standards. We also have a training program. URAC requires staff training in the policies and procedures, in the appropriate accreditation standards. And we have an online training program that, in fact, you don't even have to be a client of ours to use that. You just go to our website and click on the button under the training module and start your training. It's called Accreditation.
Just to add to that, first of all, Kristen is just launching now a poll. It's 2 questions. It helps you determine where you are in this process and gives us a little feedback about it. And at the very end, we'll also be, and there it is, we'll also be putting out a satisfaction survey about this webinar. But I did want to also mention that all of us who are senior consultants once worked at URAC as reviewers, and we have a lot of experience there, but we also still have friends at URAC. So we kind of have a call a friend type of, well, relationship in terms of saying, you can call this person, you can call that person. We have a lot of advice to give, and we have places to go to ask some questions at times. Certainly we can't ask on your behalf, but where I'm going with this is sometimes when they launch new standards, the interpretations aren't as clear yet, or the interpretations change from month 1 of a launch to month 9 of that launch, because the interpretations get more historical and real life type of experience. The reviewers start changing how that works. And so we get a heads up, not only because our clients are getting these RFIs, but then we have some questions that we have you submit, or we can submit if we go to a webinar, and we get live information that changes. It really is a living document that we use in terms of getting feedback and informing you. An RFI might come back one way one week, and then in month 9, it comes back a totally different way. And that's because of the experience of what URAC has seen out there. It hasn't changed the standard, but it changes the interpretation of the standard.
And these revised interpretations don't generally make it into the accreditation guide in real time. In fact, they never do. We track every new interpretation that we encounter. We actually document and track so that we can keep you up to date on, and then we write about it in our in the software that you operate in Goldfinch. So our interpretive guide, in this sense, is up to date with respect to this, as Lesley said, the living document that is URAC's interpretation of its standards.
So we have a few more minutes. I don't see any questions, but Sue, in this version, first of all, we have people who are in their accreditation phase and they're going to go for reaccreditation, but also there's people who are new to this and they don't know about the RPT standards and the reporting metrics. So can you talk a little bit about that, just to give people a heads up to keep letting them know what they need to do?
Sure, I'd be happy to, Les. Well, once you're accredited, URAC has a requirement in the pharmacy standards to do annual measures reporting. So how the timeline works. So let's say you got accredited in 2020. On January 1st, 2021, you would be required to start tracking the metrics. URAC releases new metrics at the new measures specification on October 1st. And on URAC's website, by module, it tells you what the mandatory measures are that you're required to report out on annually, and what the exploratory measures are. Those are the optionals. They're like the leading indicators where you can choose to meet or not meet. And both male and specialty have measures attached to them. So again, you get accredited in 2020. You start measuring January 1st, 2021. And then your reporting year would be in 2022. And it's usually between July 1st and September 30th. Now, that is subject to change. And once you have an agreement with URAC, you'll be assigned an account manager. You should reach out to your account manager periodically to see if anything has changed with the reporting year. Now, why am I telling you this? Well, there are budgetary considerations that you need to be aware of. So, for instance, one of the things that you have to budget for is the reporting fee for every year. There's a fee URAC charges for reporting the measures into their portal. They also have a requirement for you to have your data validated externally. And if you go out onto their website, you will see the organizations that they have approved as data validation vendors. And for those of you that are already accredited, they've recently updated that list and they have deleted one. I don't remember off the top of my head which one was deleted. So make sure that you're checking to see if your data validation vendor is still a recognized vendor with URAC. There are, if you go out, again, if you go out to URAC's website and you put in measures at a glance, it should take you to those measures and you can be able to look at them from a program specific perspective.
Sue, there's a question on this.
Okay.
With how late the URAC measures were released by URAC, plus the new standards, do you foresee continuous delays in this whole year when it comes to going for renewal in this year?
Let me just read that. You know, I can't speak to any of the delays with URAC. They have new leadership there. They have a new CEO. They have a new research and measurement vice president. For those of you who knew Mary Beth Farquhar, she has left there and gone to another organization. So I can't really tell you. I can't judge it. So I'm sorry. I wish I had the crystal ball, but I really don't know.
I mean,
If you have some concerns about it, I would encourage you to reach out to your account manager, or if you go out to URAC's website, it identifies who their leadership is and identifies who the vice president of research and measurement is. So you would be able to reach out to them and ask those kind of questions. And those of you who know Josh Spofford, he is the admin support for research and measurement. And so you could reach out to Josh at jspofford@urac.org.
Great. All right, we have no more questions. I will remind you that the poll has been out there with 2 questions, and you will be getting a link for a 3-question satisfaction survey. We are going to be having another webinar just like this to focus more on the core standards and the CSCD standards coming up in March. So look for those types of emails from us about this. It'll be the same type of venue that we're doing. Thank you, Sue. Thank you, Tom. This is being recorded, so you'll be able to have access to this and rewatch it or share it. Tom, do you have anything that you would like to say?
Tune in next month when there will not be snow behind me.
Oh.
I'll be back in Arizona.
You never know. Where in the world is Tom? Might just be your next question.
Hope you'll join us next month. And we're gonna try to do this every month. We've already started talking about perhaps doing a future webinar on data validation services that are part of this process. And we're also looking at some other kind of interesting issues around delegation and human resources. So you can expect to hear from us about each month about a new thing. We think this is a really good way to hear from you about your concerns and for us to talk to you about what our latest musings are. So I hope you'll join us, and so glad that you did. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.